Coming up, the impact of tribal colleges and universities. An Ojibwe leader reflects on his career and the future of coal on tribal lands. I'm Mackenzie Allen Charmley. Join us for those interviews plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
This program is made possible in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
Arizona State University welcomes 3,500 Indigenous students from Arizona and across the nation. It serves one of the largest populations of Indigenous students among U.S. colleges and universities. We created a sense of place for tribal nations to create futures of their own making through community outreach and research, taught by world-class Indigenous faculty where they see a reflection of themselves and their experiences. Find community at ASU.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Thank you for joining us. Aaliyah Chavez is away. It's the calm before the storm that will be the August primaries. On August 2nd, 5 Indigenous candidates will be running for state office in Arizona. All of them will be seeking re-election. In Kansas, Christina Haswood, previously the youngest state representative ever elected, will be running unopposed in the August primary. This will secure her win at the general election. On August 4th, Brian Terry, who is Choctaw, is running for his 5th term in the Tennessee House of Representatives. 1 week later, Peggy Flanagan is running for re-election as Minnesota's lieutenant governor. Then Indigenous candidates Markwyn Mullen and T.W. Shannon will go head-to-head in the primary runoff election. Both are Republican candidates running in the Oklahoma special election Senate race. Whatever the outcome, an Indigenous person will be in the U.S. Senate for the first time since 2005. In Washington state, the San Juan Islands waterway is being renamed to honor an Indigenous leader. The strait of water, about a half-mile wide and 2 miles long between two islands, is now named Caillou Channel. Lumi and Saanich descendant Henry Caillou was one of the state's first Indigenous elected officials. Caillou was a county commissioner and commercial fisherman who lived his entire life on an island next to the waterway named after him. The strait was named for U.S. Army General William Harney, who led the killing of Sichungu Lakota men, women, and children in Nebraska. Chair of the Committee on Geographic Names, Sarah Palmer, says people are pretty excited about the change, and the U.S. Board on Geographic Names is also reviewing the name change. A new performance about First Nations people and history of Canada's Yukon province is wowing audiences. From drum dance to Red River Jig, the stage production in the rural Western Territory is receiving rave reviews. APTN's Sarah Connors has all the sights and sounds.
From casket drumming, inland Tlingit dance, and even a Vuntug Gwich'in spin on a Red River jig. Dreaming Roots is a performance by and about First Nations people in the Yukon, weaving together works from 50-plus Yukon Indigenous artists in dance, music, storytelling, and more.
It's beautiful. It's their vision of the history of this place and its people.
Diet Van Lieshout is Dreaming Roots co-director. She says the performance is Yukon First Nations people's journey through the past and present and their dreams of the future.
This is all, this work is new for them. It's their creation, and it's traditional, it's new, it's contemporary, it's visionary. It really speaks to the climate of our Yukon society.
Will they listen to me? Tell me who are they?
Performers range from all 14 First Nations in the Yukon and were challenged to create their own works for the show. Themes include the impacts of residential school, the relationship with salmon, and Yukon's northern landscape. Van Lieshout says it wasn't easy, especially because COVID restrictions prevented the cast from gathering during the months leading up to the production.
We actually never got to really gather until 2 weeks ago, the whole cast. So people have been working in You know, they've been working individually, they've been working just with their group.
It is inside of us. It is inside of us.
Dreaming Roots had a 2-day run in Whitehorse in June, but later this year it will tour in all Yukon communities.
I would love for people to be inspired. I would love for a child to be sitting out here and go, I want to do that. I want to do that.
Sarah Connors, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
A documentary highlighting an alliance between California natives and Japanese Americans is coming to an acclaimed TV series. Manzanar Diverted, When Water Becomes Dust is set to premiere on the PBS POV series on July 18th. The series is television's longest-running showcase for independent nonfiction films and is very selective about what it offers. Manzanar Diverted tells the story of how interned Japanese Americans, ranchers, and Indigenous people defended their land and water. Lone Pine Paiute Shoshone citizen Kathy Jefferson Bancroft spoke to ICT about her nation's connection with the internment camp.
The people that were around then remember vividly today all of the people, all the cars, the buses coming through town and the big construction project they were doing. Some tribal members in this valley actually worked at Manzanar.
The documentary's team is also launching a 2-day event that includes a day of action and the broadcast. You can visit manzanardiverted.com for more information. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. Coming up, coal is no longer king, and attorney Tad Johnson reflects on his career. But first, what is the impact of tribal colleges and universities? Tribal colleges and universities are valuable institutions on Indigenous lands. There are 32 TCUs around the country. The first one started in 1968 as the Navajo Community College. Holly Mackey is the executive director for the White House Initiative on Advancing Educational Equity, Excellence, and Economic Opportunity for Native Americans and Strengthening Tribal Colleges and Universities.
So as executive director for the White House Initiative, I really think about all of the policy and practices associated with K-12 education and tribal colleges and universities and the pathways throughout. So we have a model for preschool through lifelong learning. We want to make sure that at any stage in a community member's life, we're supporting their goals and supporting the community's goals for advancing economic opportunities within their community. And really, having come from Northern Cheyenne, from a very small rural community in southeastern Montana, right, I've been thrilled to have the opportunity to have a platform to communicate to other people what our communities need. We happen to be working within an administration that is very supportive of advancing tribal sovereignty and self-determination. So a few of the things that we're doing through the initiative in order to advance those things are we are working on a Native Languages MOA and thinking through how to more intentionally incorporate Native languages into the everyday lived experiences of community members. We're also thinking about how to provide additional resources or think about the barriers that tribal colleges have, how students are unable sometimes to access those resources. So working very closely with AHEC and the different organizations to support that, to get an understanding of what people want there. And then going on site visits. One of the things we know is if you don't get out into the communities, you can't possibly understand them. And so in my short time, I have been in 7 states and I've visited 3 tribal colleges, and I've had the opportunity to really hear firsthand from folks across multiple contexts what it is they need from the administration. And I have the platform really to advance that up. And then I can share the ideas with the secretary, with the White House, and then think about how to get the resources and support back into the communities.
Mackey describes the needs of tribal colleges.
Oftentimes, tribal colleges are not funded or structured in the same way as the traditional college might be, or even HBCUs. Many of them do not accept federal financial aid, and students are heavily reliant on Pell Grants to attend schools. And then we have to think about facilities. So one of the things that has come up multiple times is even within some of the tribes that are considered to be wealthier tribes or to have really well-established colleges, we still see that structures are a problem. So you'll have this amazing opportunity to learn within your your own community and stay connected to family. And yet a lot of our colleges are still operating out of modular trailers or in facilities that need significant upgrades. What we're hearing most from students is that they appreciate the opportunity to stay connected to stay with their families, to stay with their loved ones, to stay connected to ceremony. And as a former instructor at a tribal college in my home community, I saw firsthand how important this was for students. Where I taught technical writing. No one wants to take technical writing. And yet, you can structure your class in a way that supports students and meets them where they're at. We can't correct what's happening in K-12 education. We can only create a better pathway moving forward. And so for me, this has been a tremendous opportunity to really share and uplift these voices and think about what it is that matters most. And while we know there is high need, what matters most is our own communities to our own people. And that's the message that comes through over and over and over again.
That was Holly Mackey, Executive Director for the White House Initiative on Native Americans. Last weekend in Oklahoma, Interior Secretary Deb Haaland heard stories from boarding school survivors. It was her first stop on the Road to Healing tour. Dakota McDowell-Wapakichi has this report.
Many people inside Riverside Indian School discussed their experience with federal Indian boarding schools at the first stop of the Road to Healing tour. U.S. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland launched the tour with a listening session for the descendants and survivors of federal Indian boarding schools. Riverside is the oldest federally operated Indian boarding school in the nation still operating. Testimony came from many different schools, not just Riverside. Former students from Chilocco, Concho, Fort Sill, and many other schools gave testimony. Haaland said she hopes for good to come from the event.
We all carry the trauma in our hearts. My ancestors endured the horrors of the Indian boarding school assimilation policies carried out by the same department that I now lead. This is the first time in history that a cabinet secretary comes to the table with this shared trauma, and it's not lost on me. I'm determined to use this position for the good.
The survivors want to have their voices heard about changing the system. Witnesses spoke of assimilation and disrespect shown to them by boarding school staff.
We were not allowed to speak unless spoken to. I was punished a lot because I did talk. We were not allowed to talk our language or speak our language, which I also got punished for that.
Another experience came from Shawnee Chief Ben Barnes, who spoke on behalf of a Shawnee tribal member who attended Chilocco Indian School in northern Oklahoma. Chief Barnes said her experience included horrors like sexual assault and threats of being buried in a cemetery located near the school. Barnes agreed there needs to be change.
One of the things that we've come to learn as we've explored our own legacy with the boarding school is where state and federal lands are owned, where boarding schools now reside, those lands need to revert back to the tribal nations for direct administration. Those places need to be re-sanctified and consecrated back to our sovereigns.
Now, this isn't the only stop on the tour, as Haaland and company will be traveling to Hawaii, Arizona, Michigan, and South Dakota, with more states to be announced in 2023. Reporting from Riverside Indian School in Anadarko, Oklahoma, Dakota McDowell-Wapakichi, ICT News.
The University of Minnesota's first senior director of American Indian Tribal Nations Relations is retiring. From the Boys Fort Band of Chippewa, Tad Johnson is an attorney. He served the tribal court system for more than 30 years. He was instrumental in the creation of a master's program of tribal administration and government. Earlier this week, he reflected on his career as a tribal attorney.
Well, it was a very productive time between 1990 and 1995. They just recently had passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, and so the act needed to get implemented. And so we held a series of hearings and allowed the states to negotiate compacts, and we held a series of oversight hearings on the implementation of the act, but we really didn't touch it. And the industry needed a moment to grow. The Tribal Self-Governance Act was very important. And we overturned two Supreme Court cases. One was Duro versus Reyna, which was actually overturned by my predecessor as a staffer, Frank Ducheneau, who worked for Mo Udall. And then George Miller had to overturn it a second time because the first overturning only lasted 1 year. So we had to remove the sunset clause, as they say, and make it permanent. So, and the other one we overturned had to do with the sacramental use of peyote. We amended the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. But there was a lot of activity, especially in 93 and 94, when Clinton was president and the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate. And Clinton did not veto any bills in those 2 years. So it was very productive on the Senate and the House side. So I keep looking back on that. It was one of the great times of my life. And my wife keeps pointing out, you were miserable the whole time. You get up and drink half a carafe of coffee and then sit there and watch the House before we go to bed. So, but I was obsessed with the job and every little detail and every little bill. And it was a great productive time.
Johnson describes the changes he's witnessed in law and tribal relations over the years.
Well, back then, it was really bread and butter issues. It was healthcare, housing, and those are still important issues for most tribes. A lot goes on now in tribes have a little more money. Some tribes do. Most tribes are not, wealthy by any stretch of the imaginations. But there's arguments that go on about placing land in a trust, and sometimes it's what I've been told by my successors in the House and Senate is there's a lot of tribe versus tribe stuff, which is always the worst. I mean, usually back then it was the very early days of Indian gaming, and we needed to get the basics out to Indian people, and so it was the beginning of tribes becoming more autonomous, taking over more programs from the federal government and doing more things themselves. So it was kind of the end of capacity building and self-determination and the beginning of self-governance. And that happened in Nahasda with housing and the Multiple Self-Governance Act, the 477 Act. We passed all those in those days.
Johnson talks about the impact of his tenure in the University of Minnesota's system.
Well, it started off coming to UMD. They wanted me to develop a program on how to run a reservation, and on every tribal attorney's desk across America. And I've been a tribal attorney for over 35 years. So Felix Cohen's Handbook of Federal Indian Law, but there's no handbook on how to run a reservation. And I was executive director of my reservation for a while in Bois Forte. And there was nothing that explained how appropriations work, nothing that explained accounting principles, nothing that explained, how to run things. So we wanted to develop a program that created that. And so we did. We developed the Master of Tribal Administration Governance program, which became successful. They said, expect a few students the first year. Well, we had 30 applicants. After that, we developed the M-Trees program, the Master of Tribal Resource and Environmental Stewardship. Similar idea, how do we train people to be foresters and use tribal ecological knowledge? But then I started complaining to the Twin Cities campus about the fact that the feds consult with tribes, the state consults with tribes, but the University of Minnesota, which is supposed to be the thought leader of the state, doesn't consult with tribes at all. We did it at UMD as we were developing those programs. 2 years of consultation for MTAG, 3 years for M-Trees, and but the university as a whole wasn't doing that. So I complained to one vice president of equity and diversity, and then she left and a new one came in, and he thought that idea was fascinating, that we should be doing that. And I said, and they ended up creating this position of senior director of tribal relations, and I took it, and I mean, I had to compete for it, but I got it. And I said, this is not enough. You should have somebody advising the president. And if you want to have somebody good, what I was looking at was the ASU model where they hired Peterson Zaw to advise the president. I said, you need a former tribal leader. And there's only one person I can see doing this, which is Karen Diver, who used to lead the Fond du Lac Band at Chippewa. And then she went off to advise President Obama. And then she went off, got hired by the University of Arizona. And I was like, why is she at Arizona? Why isn't she here at Minnesota? And so finally I got listened to. The president, who was by then a woman, met Karen, they hit it off. And it was like, then I had kind of like mission accomplished. So the three things I accomplished while I was there, I think we got American Indian Advisory Boards going at all the campuses. We created something called the Truth Project, where we started a dialogue with all the tribes and wanted to get the past, present, and future snapshot of their view of the university. And then hiring Karen was the number one thing. So after we did that, I was ready to go. So I turned 65 tomorrow, actually. And I thought it's a good time to retire. So I did.
That was Ted Johnson from the University of Minnesota. The problem for some 25 tribal nations is how to unwind coal dollars and the jobs that it provides. Just as important is the question, are there resources available to make that transition work? ICT's Mark Trahant has this report.
A century ago, Scientific American said this about coal: we cannot get along without coal. Even in this enlightened age of hydroelectric developments, gasoline engines, alcohol-burning devices, and so on, coal remains the prime fuel. So much so that the magazine concluded a coal famine would affect our entire national life. Now, it's the other way around. Coal affects our entire national life. Once it was the largest source of electricity, today it's a little more than 1/3. Across the planet, utility companies are ending their purchases of coal. Just last week, Idaho Power said its transition away from coal is 6 years ahead of schedule. Why now? Coal is 2.5 times dirtier than other fossil fuels, creating even more greenhouse gas emissions. If we can't transition away from coal, there's little chance we will be successful with other fossil fuels. The Navajo Nation has been wrestling with this issue for more than a decade. The Navajo Generating Station, a coal-fired plant near Page, Arizona, closed in 2019. Another plant near Farmington, New Mexico, is set to end production at the end of this month. And a third plant, Four Corners Power, is exploring options to keep going. Jonathan Nez is president of the Navajo Nation. Last week, he asked the Arizona Corporation Commission to approve a $100 million fund for transition costs.
Navajo people lost their jobs because of these closures. But what we're trying to do is develop a transition, and right, to let others know that you can't just close a power plant just like that, and that's what happened with Navajo. And a lot of lessons learned, and what we're telling others with coal-fired power plants is those owners should let the community know ahead of time, maybe even 5 years ahead of time, that it's going to close, so that it doesn't have a big impact like it did with the Navajo Generating Station, the Peabody coal mine, and the revenues that were utilized to provide direct services to our Navajo people. And that's where the Just Transition movement really ties in. We are pressing on the state of Arizona to put some money aside to do that. New Mexico has done that, as you know. The Energy Transition Act actually put some dollars aside to help with the transition from closing a power plant to something more greener.
This is a challenge for coal producers across the country, including the 25 tribal nations that own coal resources. How should tribes accomplish a just transition, moving to a cleaner energy source while at the same time preserving jobs? Janine Yazzie is the Southwest Regional Director for the Indian Collective. She has been working on these issues for more than a decade.
I hate when I hear people say how they were surprised and shocked about how fast this transition has come, because people have been telling them for quite some time that this was coming. And I hope this is a lesson that can be learned, because there are other things and other challenges and other threats that we're facing where we can see the same pattern play out, or we can learn from this. We can call our losses that were unnecessary in the first place because everyone was advising against it, except for, the businessmen who saw money to be made somehow when everyone else was transitioning away from coal.
The shift away from coal is a big story. Globally, the United Nations has been clear about the need to dismantle coal infrastructure and phase out that fossil fuel over the next 8 years. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned Tuesday of a dangerous disconnect between what scientists and citizens are demanding to curb climate change and what governments are actually doing about it.
We are witnessing a historic and dangerous disconnect. Science and citizens are demanding ambitious and transformative climate action. Meanwhile, many governments are dragging their feet. This inaction has grave consequences.
When the pandemic took hold, the federal government invested more than $31 billion into tribal communities to help people navigate that plague. Yet, climate change represents a larger crisis, and the investment has not kept up. It's particularly challenging for the communities that have relied on jobs from coal.
When we saw the turnaround and the huge influx of investment into Indian country as a result of the pandemic, we were seeing in real time something happen that we were told was never a possibility. And so I think that we should take that example of how quickly they responded and how much was possible and made available to invest in Indian country. And a lot of that money is for infrastructure as well. To take some of what we have available now and to request for similar investments, not just for Indian country, but for all of the communities that are suffering with these stranded assets and the infrastructure that is there that have been, reliant upon a coal economy for better or for worse.
In Phoenix, Arizona, Mark Trahant, ICT News.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For all the latest, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives. I'm Mackenzie Allen Charmley.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.
ICT News is produced by Indig Public Media.
This program is made possible in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.